All right, so this video we're going to talk about operator overload. So when we create our classes, there's times where we need to use operators. For example, let's say we have our date class, right? And this represents a day such as today, which is March 22nd. Excuse me, March 22nd, 2020, right? What if we wanted to know what date it would be a week from now? Uh, we it would be nice to be able to say something like date, next week is equal to D1 plus 7, right? That would be a pretty nice way to use a date. So we actually can do that. Unlike a lot of other programming languages, C++ does have the ability to define what this operator actually means. Other languages we would have to use, we would have to create an add function. We would have to do something like D1 dot, we would have to do something like date next week is equal to D1 dot add 7. That would be something that we would do in a language like Java or JavaScript, but we actually can change the meaning of this add operator to do whatever we like to do. And so even though we can make it mean whatever we want, it's best practices to make it kind of go along the lines of what this operator would normally do. We don't want to have D1 plus 7 mean that you're going to create 7 new dates, right? We don't want something like that because that actually doesn't fall along the lines with what the plus operator would actually do. So there's a lot. You basically can overload any operator that C++ has to offer, but you do it in different ways. So I'm going to go over a few ways to implement a few of the operators, but I'm gonna leave it up to you to look at the book to figure out how to do some of the other ones. So some of the popular ones that we'll do would be plus, minus, and then like our extraction operator and our insertion operator. Sorry, I had those backwards. Our insertion operator and our extraction operator. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about these three here, and then I'll let you figure out how to do some of the other ones. I'm sorry, we'll also talk about equal. All right, so with the plus operator, So with the plus operator, this is going to be a friend function. And the reason why it's a friend function is because the plus doesn't need an object in order to call it, right? If I was to go into my main function and I was to do something like D1, D2, and then I was to create a new date, let's say D3, and make that equal to D1 plus D2, if you notice, there's not an object calling that plus function, right? This plus function is not connected to any particular object. So in order for me to be able to access some of the private members, if I need to for these objects to make this operator work, then this would need to be a friend. I would need to say, hey, make this function a friend function so that it can have special access to the private members of my function of my class. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that would look like. So inside my class, I would write my date class. And then, of course, let's just assume that we have our private variables, which would be int month, day and year. All right, and so then we will use a public, and we will just create a friend function. All right, so we declare it as friend. And now if we look at plus, so I'm going to implement this one and not necessarily the first one that I showed where I say date plus 7. You can overload the operators as many times as you want. So the way the plus operator works is that you have actually, yeah, let me go ahead and I'll show you this one. This one will probably be better for you to look at. Or maybe I'll show both. We'll see. We'll see how I'm feeling. All right. So first of all, we have to name it. We have to label it as a friend function, right? And if you remember from our previous video, that means that this is actually not a member function or a static function. It does not belong to the class, right? But it is a friend. We are given permission to use for this function to use our private members because we're saying it is a friend. All right. So if I was going to implement where we say D1 plus 7, this is going to return a date, right? It's going to return a new date that is a week away from the original date. So that means that this returns a date object. And often we will make this a reference. The next thing we want to do is we want to say that it's an operator. So all of our operator functions use the keyword operator, right? And then it's followed by the actual operator. All right. And so now the way the operator works is that this is going to take two arguments, right? This is considered the first the operator, right? So whatever's to the left of the plus is going to be the first operator. Excuse me, the first argument. And then whatever's to the right is going to be your second argument. So in this case, we have two arguments. The first one is going to be of type date. Now it's important that we make this constant, right? We want to make this constant because we don't want our add function modifying the object it's trying to add, right? Imagine if you were to do, you were to say int y is equal to x plus 1, and then all of a sudden after you're done, x no longer has the same value, right? Let's say int x equals 2, right? And then you say int y equals x plus 1, and now y is equal to 3, but then all of a sudden x is equal to 3 as well, right? We don't want this operator to be able to modify anything that it is getting the value from. All right, so let me go ahead and finish this function. So that's why we want to make it constant so that this function can't modify what's being passed to it. So we make it constant, and then of course this is going to be date. We also want to make it a reference so that we are actually getting the value from this particular device and not a copy. And the reason is because sometimes we actually don't have a copy constructor, and that's something that we'll talk about later. If you don't have a copy constructor, let me make this look more like an ampersand. If you don't have a copy constructor, then when you pass a class that you developed yourself to a function, the computer does not know how to make a copy of that variable. So we'll pass this as a reference. And then, of course, we just give it a name. So I'm just going to call it date. And then a second one is an integer, right? So we just say, we'll just call that one a constant too, because we want to make sure that this integer doesn't get changed either. So we'll say constant int, and then we'll call it, I guess we'll call it num. Right, so that's going to be the signature for our function. So now the way we would implement that, so say we're outside of our class, we already declared it as a friend here, so we don't declare it as a friend inside of our implementation when we're defining the function. So we just start with, it's going to be a date, and it's going to be a reference, and then we say operator plus, and then we do the same exact signature. So I'm going to say constant date, and it's my ampersand, date, and constant int num. And then inside here is where I want to define how to determine where a week is. And of course, this is going to be pretty an involved functionality because we have to take account of if we are, you know, if the month is going to change or if the year is going to change by adding a week. But we would put all that code here. But just as a simple. This is not the correct way to implement it, but this is a simple thing. So we can say we'll create a new date, right? Because we are returning a date and we cannot modify this date. So we'll create a new date and we'll call it D, right? And then I can just say D.day plus equals 7. Of course, this is not the right implementation, right? This is not correct. We would need to accommodate for if changing the day is going to actually change the month, and if changing the month is actually going to change the year. But that is just a basic example of how to use it. And notice that because I made it a friend, then I am actually able to access the private variable of date. And yeah, this is really not correct. This should be D.day is equal to date.day plus 7. But once again, like I said, this is not correct. Just want to emphasize on that that's not correct. But this is an example to let you know that you can use the private variables. All right. The secret word today is pizza. All right. So now let's go to let's look at another operator. Again, I said that secret word is pizza. All right. So the next operator is going to be our insertion operator. All right. So our insertion operator is going to look something like this. Okay, so if we're in our class again, class date, and of course we have our int month, day, year. All right, and inside our public, we'll have our extraction operator. Excuse me, our insertion operator. So that's going to be a friend as well. And the return value is going to actually be, this is not very intuitive, but the return value is going to be the data type of what our cout is, right? Which is actually OStream. And that also needs to be a reference. All right, and then we say operator, and then we use the insertion operator. And so this is going to take two variables as well, right? It's going to take two arguments as well. So when we use our insertion operator, for example, if we say cout, and then we wanted to say, our date D1, this is going to be the first argument of our function. And this is going to be our second argument. All right, and so if we're passing a C out, that means we're passing a variable of type OStream. So we would need to pass that in there. And this time we don't want to make it constant. We don't want to make it constant because this operator actually makes changes to this cout variable. So if we make it constant, then we're not going to be able to perform the extraction operator, excuse me, the insertion operator on the cout variable that we're going to pass to it, and then it will not actually work. So let's go ahead and just make this OStream, and this needs to be a reference as well. And then we'll just make a new name for it. So I'm just going to call it out instead of cout. And then I'm going to pass in. Now this will need to be constant because I don't want to make changes to what I'm seeing out, right? I don't want my insertion operator to actually make changes to something that is only trying to print to the console, right? So we're going to make that constant. And I'm going to change this to date. This needs to be referenced again. And then we'll just call it something like date. All right, so that would be my declaration. All right, so now let's implement that. So again, it's a friend function, so we don't need to redeclare it. So we just do the return value, string. And since this is not a class function, right, it's a friend function, I don't need my class scope resolution. So I just say operator. And then I say OStream, right? I pretty much just copy the same thing I have over here. Copy the same thing. So OStream out, and then constant date. And then here I just want to define how I want my date to print, right? So I could probably do something like this, right? So I'm passing out. So out is actually, right, the first argument. So it's really my cout. So I just write the statement just like I would normally write it inside my main function. So I'm going to say out, and then I'm going to use the insertion operator, and then I want to say, date dot month. Maybe I want to do it this way. Date dot day. And then date dot year. And then maybe I'll put an end out. All right, so then that will output my date in the format that I want my date to work. And then, of course, it has a return value of OStream, so I would need to return my out after that. So return out. Right? So now I just gave my class the ability to do something like this, right? If I was in my int main, I could actually go and create a new variable, date, D1, right? And then I could say cout D1, right? And let's say that my date was, if this works like the date object that we had, right? My date, since I didn't put any value to it, my date would be March 22nd, right? My date would be set to 03/22/2020, right? But then when I output it, it will say 03/22/2020, right? Because that's how we defined it to be here. If we didn't overload this operator, as soon as I try to say cout D1, I am going to get a red squiggly line because the computer does not know how to output it. But since we did, then this is not the case, right? This won't happen. All right, so then I'm going to do one more, which is going to be the assignment operator. So the assignment operator is a little bit different, right? The assignment operator is going to make us be able to do something like this. Date D1, right? And then let's say I created another date D2, and then let's say I pass in a date. So I'll pass in 12, 25, 2020. Right, so we have Christmas inside this date. The way the equal sign would work is that I can say date D3 is equal to D2, right? And if I do that, then D3 should now have the same date, right, as D2. So this should be 12, 25, 2020, right? But we have to program our class to be able to do this. Of course, with a simple class as date, this is not going to be a problem, right? The compiler actually already knows how to make it equal. But when we start using things like pointers, then it is important that we actually implement what equal actually means. So the way we actually implement assignment operator is a little bit different than the way we did the other operators. And that's because this operator is actually going to make changes to this variable. Whereas in when we did plus, right? If we did plus doesn't actually make changes to the variable, right? It gets the value of what this would be, and then it sets it to a new variable, and it returns a new variable with that date, right? If I say date next week is equal to D1 plus 7, right? This is getting calculated first, and then it's setting that value to this particular variable, right? So it is creating a new variable with a new value, and then returning that new value. But when I say equal, I'm not doing that. I'm actually making changes to this variable. So in order to make changes to this variable, then it can't be a friend function. It needs to be a member function of this class. And so we implement it a little bit differently, but not much different. So let's go ahead and just set up our class again. Oops. All right, and so inside this class, we are going to call this one. This one is not going to be a friend, right? This needs to be a member variable, so we just do exactly the same way. So there's a couple ways that you can implement the return value. Some say you can just make it void, and others say to actually return whatever your class type is. I'm just going to go ahead and say let's return whatever the class type is. Either way should be able to work, and we're going to make that a reference. All right, and so now we say operator, and then we put equal. And now the assignment operator only takes one, right? Because now this is a class variable, so it's not about what's on the left side or the right side anymore, right? It's just about what's on the right side. So it's going to take whatever is on the right side. So we'll say constant, right? Constant, because we don't want to change what's on the right side when we try to make something equal to it. So constant date. And we'll call this date. All right, so that's the way we would declare it, right? And so notice it's not a friend function, so it's a member function, right? Think of this. Think of date D3 is equal to D2. think of this as actually being D3 calling this function, right? It'd be something like D3 dot equal, right? Using the dot operator and calling a member function and then saying D2. That's what's happening here when we do this. It's actually doing this. It's D3 calling the dot operator, calling its member function that is named equal, and then it is passing in the variable on the right side as its argument. All right, so let's go ahead and implement that. So we have date reference as the return value. Now, since this is part of the class, we need the scope resolution. So we'll say date, and then we'll say operator, and then equal. And then, of course, we'll do the same values, const date, and a reference, and we'll call this date. All right, and so now inside this function, we can do, right, since this is a member function, that means I have access to my member variables now, right? So I can say month is equal to date dot month. And then I can say day is equal to date dot day. And then I can say year is equal to date dot year. All right? And then since I have a actually, I'm sorry. The way I just showed you right here is if we were going to have a void return, right? Because then I don't need to return anything because I actually just changed all the values. I changed all the values that inside my member functions. I changed all my member variables to the member variables of the object that was passed to it. So in implementation, I showed you this would actually work with void because I don't need to really return anything. This would be a void, but let me show you how it would be if it wasn't void. So I apologize for that. If it wasn't void, it would be something like this: date, operator equals, and then this would be const date, and then here we would create a new date. We'll call it D. And then here we can call our constructor and we can say date dot month, date dot day, and date dot year. All right, all I'm doing is calling the constructor that we have where we can pass in the month, day, and year to our constructor. And I'm just calling the member variables from the date that's being passed to it, right? Alternatively, I could have just did this. I could have said date D, and then I could say D dot set. Actually, I don't need to call set date because it's yeah, actually, I'm sorry. I would have to say D dot set date, and then I would set it to the not set date, set day, and I would set it to the day variable of the object that was passed to it. So date dot day. Then I can say D dot set month, date dot month, and then D dot set year, date dot year. Right. So now I just made a copy of the date that was passed, right? So the day, the month, and the year is equal to the same thing as the date that was passed to it. And then since I'm doing the return method, then I just return D at the end. So those are the different ways that you do it. If it was a void function, I can just do it this way, where I just change the member variables directly onto the object. Here, I just create a new object and then I return that object, and it'll work either way. All right, that is operator overload. I am expecting to get a lot of questions on this one, so feel free to answer any questions as you need them. All right, thank you.